I often start this lecture by trying for you to imagine yourselves. Imagine yourself signing on as a crew member of a Nantucket whale ship in the 18th or early 19th century. You'll be working not only in a dangerous occupation, but living for several years in crowded, unsanitary conditions, most likely without a trained physician, without an understanding of nutrition and disease, or the availability of modern drugs. At least depending on the year that you're sailing, you might actually have health insurance. So, referring to sailors in general, U.S. Court Justice John Story wrote in 1823, "Sailors are liable to sudden sickness from change of climate, exposure to perils, and exhausting labor. They are generally poor and friendless and acquire habits of gross indulgence, carelessness, and improvidence. They most often in foreign ports suffer accumulated evils of disease, poverty, and sometimes perish for want of suitable nourishment." That perhaps describes what many of these sailors were under at the time. So what was medicine like on the whale ship? Well, today I'm going to start and talk a little bit about some background. What was the medical and scientific knowledge of the period? What was the nature of the medical profession in the whaling period? And we'll discuss what diseases the whalers had. And we'll finalize by putting that all together and telling you what the actual medical care on board the whalers was like. So the theories of Hippocrates and Galen, some of you know of these, persisted to some degree into the 19th century. Disease was thought to be the result of an imbalance of body fluids and humors. There was recognition of contagions and diseases could be transmitted, but treatment for many orders consisted simply of trying to remove the assumed cause of the sickness. This typically was done by bleeding, purging, sweating, urinating, defecating, and vomiting. Healing was based upon restoring the natural balance, an approach similar to in some aspects of what we try to do today with good diet and exercise. But the theory often ignored the fact that disease was a result of external factors and genetics. Advances in the basic theory of away from the humoral medicine concept was very slow in coming. True science was developed through the 19th century almost exclusively in Europe, not the United States. And I've listed here some of the breakthroughs, if I may use the term we use in the medical press today. And I just lost my speaker, but of course this is important to us because the English and James Lind found that actually you could treat scurvy with fruit. And you see nothing there happened in the United States until 1846 when general anesthesia was developed at Mass General. So, what was the status of the medical profession? Well, English sea captains were required by law to have a ship's surgeon. Now, that did not have to be a member of the Royal College of Physicians, but the English had standards. You had to have a trained medical person on your ship. American sailors and American ships did not have that requirement. For the most part, the duties of medical care were left to the master, and if the captain was injured or sick, the duties would fall to the first mate. In some cases, when a wife traveled on a voyage, they often performed those services. Some American whale ships actually did have a doctor. They did not always start on their voyages in that capacity. We'll shortly discuss one of these physicians, a Nantucketer, physician John King. Dr. Tom Noby from New Bedford actually joined a New Bedford whaling ship in Hawaii to get a ride home, essentially. And there was an unknown doctor on the Wilmington whaler Lucianne who signed on as a common sailor. And his profession did come to light when there was a serious injury on a whaleboat. Most doctors at the turn of the century, the 19th century, never went to medical school, and they were trained in an apprenticeship system. In 1800, there were only 3 medical schools in the United States: Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, and Columbia, which, of course, before the Revolution was King's College. In 1810, there were 5, 1860, 65, 1900s, there were 155 medical schools, more than there are actually accredited today. In the US, unlike the English, there were no uniform standards of licensing procedures for physicians. There were simply no standards. In 1910, Abraham Flexer issued a very famous report sponsored by the Carnegie Foundation that essentially resulted in the closing of most of those schools. They were essentially diploma mills. Now, there were physicians around, though, and if we go back to our extraordinary women of Nantucket, in keeping with our tradition, Lydia Folger Fowler received her medical degree from the Central Medical College of New York in 1850, the second woman to earn a medical degree in this country and the first American woman to do so. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was born in England, received her MD degree a year earlier. Lucretia Coffin Mott and Mariah Mitchell were cousins of hers, were cousins of Lydia Folger. One notable exception, as I mentioned earlier, substituting as the ship's physician or the ship's surgeon, was John King. He was a 1832 graduate of New York College of Physicians and Surgeons. He signed on to the Nantucket whale ship Aurora, originally, interesting enough, as a common sailor. We are really fortunate to have his journal in the NHA library. His handwriting is exquisite, very elegant and clear, far different from most physicians today. So doctors were rare and poorly trained in the 18th and 19th century. Diagnosis consisted techniques of smelling urine, surgery was rudimentary, and physicians' fees were high. So families tended to treat themselves, which of course you all know meant women were the healers, and your pharmacy was in your own backyard. Many women distinguished themselves as herb doctors outside the home. Lucy Lewis Marks, who was the mother of Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition, was famous all over the country for her knowledge in herbal medicine. On Nantucket, though, our tradition of women healers actually goes back to the mid-1600s with Winoma, the daughter of a chief of one of the 2 warring Wampanoag factions. And because of her reputation as a healer, tradition says that she tended the sick of the rival faction and fell in love. Love and good health always comes together and cures everything. So to summarize the state of medical care when our Nantucketers went to sea, American medical science was certainly far behind the Europeans. The great experiments and work in the late 19th century about germ theory was much too late for the Nantucketers. The whaling industry was kind of falling off at that time. There was a shortage of qualified physicians. Most medical care was conducted in the home by the family and by the women, which, interesting enough, it's actually probably true today, just as I may pause for a minute. Most women now actually outnumber men in medical schools, and that's been a trend for about the last 20 years. And if you look at recent surveys, it suggests that women are the ones in the household that actually make the medical decisions. They're the ones that decide which doctors you go to, which insurance you should get. So women has always had a large role in the family and in medical care. And of course, as I said, traditional physicians and so forth were rare on ships at that time, including our whalers. So we talked about physicians. And like today, you can't always find a doctor during the whaling period. You can't find a doctor today, but you can always find a lawyer, Schuyler. Remember that, okay? So what were some of the legal requirements? Well, before the Revolution, I'll just put these all on. Before the Revolution, admiralty and maritime laws were very fragmented. Several colonies established their own laws, which were often in conflict with each other. After the Revolution, the U.S. did establish some basic laws for health of the sailors on ships, particularly greater than 175 tons or a crew of greater than 16, which would have qualified most Nantucket whale ships. Ships had to carry what's called an adequate medicine chest, and in fact, hospitals were established for sailors. The present U.S. Public Health Service evolved from these maritime hospitals and is in part why today U.S. Public Service physicians actually wear maritime uniforms. Joseph Story, in 1823, in his landmark decision of Hardin versus Gordon, expanded the sailors' medical rights beyond access to a medicine chest. Of course, how do you define what's adequate? By stating that ship owners were responsible for health care of their crew, including living and medical expenses. He went further in 1832 with Reed versus Canfield, a decision that covered sailors injured or who became sick while on shore leave. And you also remember that Justice Story was also the judge involved with the slave ship Amistad ruling. So guess what? Mandatory health care goes back a long time in this country. It goes back to really efforts to provide medical care for the sailors and our whalers. Of course, I always love this quote from Thomas Jefferson in that period. He said, "If people let government decide what foods we eat and what medicines they take, their bodies will soon be in a sorry state, as they are the souls of those who live under tyranny." I wonder how he would have made out in today's Bates. So in any event, now, what were some of the medical problems on the whalers? What did they encounter? Of course, the common diseases of our time, such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, were not prevalent in the 19th century. People did not live long enough to acquire these diseases because of infection, death in childbirth, or trauma. Nor did they have the lifestyle that would encourage the development of these modern medical problems. It's hard to get fat when you are climbing the rigging and cutting in whales. So what about the whalers? What should we be looking at, and what did I really find? And I had a great time going through all the logs. Okay, first of all, trauma is obviously a problem they had. And if OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, had existed at that time, they certainly would have closed down the industry. Frequent falls from rigging, the use of sharp-edged tools on a slippery rolling deck, working with boiling oil, this Nantucket sleigh ride, those are all typical job descriptions of the workplace. So here's just, I'm going to read you a few, and there's hundreds of these in the journals that we have, in the logs. The logbook of Clarkson of 1838 voyage says, "Man bitten badly by shark while cutting in." The logbook, the Asia, recorded severe injury when cabin boy fell from mizzenmast, senseless and convulsive fits. He did, by the way, recover. and from what I can get from reading, his treatment appeared to be primarily prayers to God. But many of the drugs used in the whaling voyage, such as mercury and lead, were so toxic that you might agree that praying may have actually been a good outcome and a good advantage. And then, of course, we have the Nauticon. The log was kept by the captain's wife, Susan Veeder, and she is quite specific. Jack Wright was badly hurt overboard. Third mate fell from main top gallant head and was killed almost instantly, breathing only a few times. Line fouled and whale dragged second mate out of boat and underwater. Was taken out minutes later, quite exhausted and vomiting considerable blood. Of course, this one I really love. This was not a Nantucket whale ship, so we were smarter. This was a New Bedford ship. Captain George Clark was severely injured when he was hit by flukes of a whale. He bled copiously from mouth and nose. You know what his treatment was? Additional bleeding by his mates. Just what he needed. So, living conditions. Obviously, trauma was common, but the whalers' living conditions were certainly not ideal for good health. Common sailors lived in close contact in small quarters. Rats, cockroaches, and fleas were the facts of daily life. And I'm sure the food was not prepared by the standards of the Nantucket Board of Health. Now, many people have asked me about diet and nutritional diseases. So what about scurvy and other nutritional diseases? Scurvy is a disease that results from the lack of vitamin C, which is required for correct collagen synthesis. As mentioned above, it was well established in 1753 that the disease could be prevented by ingestion of fruit. Even so, when I did a search of the NHA library records, there is a mention of, believe it or not, 11 cases, including 2 deaths, including the captain of the Alabama in 1847, all related to scurvy. And not always knowing when they could actually acquire fresh fruit, the whalers would preserve potatoes and cabbage in molasses. That sounds wonderful. Another nutritional disease common in sailors was beriberi. Beriberi is a nervous system ailment caused by vitamin B1 or thiamine deficiency. Additional to vitamin C and thiamine deficiency, they were also risked becoming deficient in niacin and riboflavin, as a sailor's diet could hardly be considered what we would say well-balanced. In addition to diet, of potatoes I talked about, it consisted of salted meats, beans, peas, hardtack. Wonderful. An English author referring to hardtack writes, "The bread brought the skin off men's mouths, and so spoiled the gums and loosened their teeth that they cannot eat their food." Wonderful. Now, obviously, we have to talk about infection. They were exposed to several infectious diseases, not only as a result of their foreign travels, but also from within the United States. And if you look at this list of various epidemics in the United States, this was not a great place to live. It was pretty dangerous just to be here in the United States. If you look at some of these, we had malaria going all the way, in some cases, into the 20th century. So, however, their health benefited, I think, this is a theory of mine, in a way from the isolation of their work. They lived in virtual quarantine. Vector-borne diseases such as malaria, yellow fever, and dengue are not communicable from person to person, but are transmitted to humans by insects and arthropods, such as Lyme disease on Nantucket, which is spread by ticks. Whalers were at little risk for disease when they were at sea. The danger arose when they left their ships and acquired communicable diseases from other seamen and natives, many of whom had actually been infected by their contacts with explorers and visitors from Europe and the Americas. I found documenting specific diseases was not an easy task. The keeper of the log books were not trained. What was the cause when it would say fever, diarrhea, or weakness? Was weakness actually a cause by beriberi, or was weakness the fact that some sailor was just plain tired? Most of the historic information comes from the well-documented English maritime system that had certified medical personnel on all ships, and the Admiralty spent a significant amount of resources to actually collect statistics. However, they weren't always correct. The English kept detailed records. I love this one. The Sick and Hurt Board, that's what it was called, the Sick and Hurt Board in London concluded that the high rate of insanity on English men of war was due to seamen banging their heads on low beams while drunk. So these are some of the diseases that are frequently in the logs. If you go back to John King, I remember said he had a great log. His most frequent diseases was actually gonorrhea, diarrhea, and dysentery, as well as trauma. That was a major problem. So how about medical care? So what did the captain use? I said the captain was the guy in charge here. He actually had a lot of tools. He had medical guides. The first one, and of course most of these medical guides were actually written by the English, and they would include everything from lists of surgical and dental instruments and medications, including the famous medicine chest, to detailed instructions on amputation. Of course, I have this vision of a whaling captain standing over a man with his leg about to be amputated, I would note without anesthesia, I may add, and reading his guidebook like this. I have problems reading the instructions when putting together some simple apparatus of modern life. Of course, then there was the tale. This is a tale. And then there was a tale told of a Captain Coffin who was injured himself and required a leg amputation. He held a pistol and said to his mate, "Now, sir, you're going to lop off this here leg, and if you flinch, well, sir, you're going to get shot in the head." Both men have reported to have fainted after the procedure. Now, I talked, here's a guidebook. This is one that's in Mystic Seaport Museum. Here's the medicine chest I talked about. I said, remember, an adequate medicine chest was required by law now. And of course, it contained various herbs and chemicals, and they were labeled with numbers corresponding to symptoms or diseases. For example, for diarrhea, you give number 6. For headache, you give number 2. And there's the story of a sea captain who ran out of 11, and his solution was to give the sailor equal parts of 5 and 6. And this, I recall, was not a Nantucket captain. This comes from another whaling city. Now, the recommended drugs and herbs listed in the medicine chest evolved over time, in part because of a change in medical practice, and in part because of keeping herbs fresh on long voyages. In fact, Dr. King's journal, and he talks about 47 different medications and preparations, and herbs being certainly fewer and more chemicals were in his earlier guides. Then in the earlier guides, Dr. King acquired drugs from a British ship surgeon to bring his chest up to what he called up to date and up to standards. So let's look at a typical chest. Ingredients. Of course, I love this. Think about these poor guys had to do. Look at some of these. Copper, zinc, lead. We all know that's good for you. Mercury, okay. And this calomel was a very frequently used medication. Of course, that has mercury again. Of course, it has 90 proof alcohol as well. And if you just keep going through this, now here are these two, digitalis and quinine. Digitalis and quinine actually work. I could go on forever about the history of digitalis. It was actually the first well-controlled clinical trial ever done of a drug. And this is Peruvian bark. If you go back through all the literature of time, that's quinine, Peruvian bark used for malaria, intermittent fever. It was very expensive. It was originally brought back from Peru by Jesuits very early on. But because it actually worked, it was always extremely expensive. So we can go on through these. You can see lead again, mercury again, good stuff, all right? So, like lead, the symptoms of lead poisoning, the main symptoms include headache, abdominal pain, memory loss, kidney failure, male reproductive problems, weaknesses, and so forth. And of course, mercury, we all know the story of the Mad Hatters, the felt hat makers who were all a little bit crazy because they had mercury fumes they had to deal with all the time. So standard medication of the time. Just as there were not uniform standards for physicians, there were no laws governing stability, purity, or ingredient concentration in any of these medications. And in fact, there were no meaningful enforced standards for medications in the United States till 1902. There was an attempt in 1820 to standardize medication with the establishment of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, but they virtually had no regulatory authority at all. So what support did the captain have at his disposal? Well, I said he could have house calls, ER visits, consultations. Whalers would often ask for assistance from ships with doctors and surgeons. Meeting another ship, particularly a British man of war, if we weren't at war with them at the time at least, would be a great idea. They had the best trained physicians. Stopping at a missionary station would offer an opportunity for medical assistance. Ships would often stop and pay to Peru, where there was a hospital, either to have a doctor come aboard or leave a sick sailor. There were other facilities in Valparaiso, Hawaii, and Tahiti. In 1839, David Baker, the master of the whale ship American, paid $12 to a French physician from Peru to treat two sick sailors. As I calculate, this fee was the equivalent to the value of almost 1/2 of a barrel of case oil. $12 is about $325 using Consumer Price Index data for 2018. Medical costs have always been high. The logbook of the New London Vesper records a captain asking other ships for advice to deal with someone that was entangled in the line of a whaleboat. In addition to all of these, medical guides, house calls, consultations, some lucky captains had a valuable asset, their wives. Wives would accompany a captain on some occasions, and of course would serve as the ship's nurse and medical practitioner. While the captain and other crew members of the New Bedford, Florida, turned away and could not watch, Eliza Williams, the captain's wife, cradled a sailor's head in her lap and dressed his abdominal stab that he received during a fight with another sailor. It's interesting to note that in Dr. King's journal, that gonorrhea was one of the most frequently noted diseases, of course, along with wounds. Little is documented about the long-term effects of mercury treatments on whalers with venereal diseases. And that was the primary treatment, nor the proliferation of this disease on Nantucket after the whalers returned home. After all, these diseases were easily recognized and were already present in the United States at that time. As I stated at the beginning of this talk and the introduction, I suggested that whale ships in the 18th and 19th century was not a conducive environment for good health. Dangerous work, health and safety regulations were non-existent, whalers lived in cramped quarters, a healthy diet was not available unless provisions could be obtained during their long voyages, and there was certainly a lack of modern medicine or trained physicians. The intrinsic nature and danger of their work could not be avoided. But I think I should add, as I've pointed out, the medical care itself was probably a contributing factor to the unhealthy environment. Heavy metals, bleeding, just wonderful, just wonderful. Certainly not part of a modern day cruise. They did have some advantages. When they were at sea in virtual quarantine and not exposed to disease, if they did not become sick when they went ashore. The whalers certainly had their daily exercise, and they did have some form of health insurance. And if they were really lucky, they had a woman on board. Thank you very much.